that's just such an amazing song. There are some songs that we do feel are just touched from heaven, and I think that is one that is like that, because it just lifts us into his presence. So I was preparing to talk this week, thinking about it. I kept jumping about from this verse to that verse to this verse. I probably was getting on Ian's nerves because I'm saying, I think I might use this. No, I think I'm meant to use that. And then I was talking to Nicola. I said, do you know, I think I'm meant to use this. And I thought, Lord, what are you saying? And then last Sunday, and then on Tuesday, when we were talking about the difficulties different people have faced during lockdown, I then began to realise that all of the verses were relevant. What did we dislike about lockdown? Some disliked the impersonality, as it were, of Zoom. Some missed the touching, the cuddles from grandchildren, the hugs from friends. Wearing masks, is that actually an imposition? Is it really needed? Do we really want to comply with the government? Is it a loss of liberty? Is it the start of something that we need to begin to fear because something's being imposed on us? And then I began to realise that some of the different things that had been creeping in over the last 4 weeks were all about people who had at some point been, in quotes, in lockdown, but actually not the comfortable lockdown that we found ourselves in. So what I really want to do is to tell you a few stories and where I think they might help us in verses that were important to them and the way forward. John Bunyan, who wrote our first hymn, was a tinker by trade, following in his father's footsteps. Now, it's interesting, he was a tinker by trade. Nowadays, we kind of put a connotation on the word tinker. But it meant that he used to, it was an important job. He used to sharpen scythes, all sorts of things. It was a proper trade. It was something that was needed. You would know, tools do not have to be kept. They have to be sharp if they're meant to be to saw things. If they're meant to screw, they have to have a decent point. That was his job. He was a tinker by trade, following in his father's footsteps. But his mother died when he was 10, and his father quickly remarried. And yet John knew the trade by the time he was 10. We didn't start learning at 18, 19, as young people do when they go to university nowadays for their trade. The trade training started right from the beginning. And he went and joined the Parliamentary Army, which would be the Roundheads, of course, because of how far back it is. And there it seems that he didn't really necessarily live a Christian life. And after leaving the army, whilst playing the game of cat, now apparently the game of cat seems to me like it's a mixture of baseball and cricket. You threw something up, a bit of wood up, you hit it with a stick, and to do with what you knocked it down, people gambled on that. So the thing about it was a gambling game, probably all playing around in a square, but it was putting money on it. And then one Sunday, apparently this is important, it was a Sunday, because he had, in those days they were expected to go to church, even as a young adult, etc. He heard this voice saying, "Wilt thou leave thy sins and go to heaven, or halve thy sins, and go to hell. So apparently, he left the game and began his fight for salvation. He tells of his conscience-haunted struggles, upward striving, and he was very human, he said, his recurrent backsliding. But then he married, and he seems to have settled down, and really, because his wife knew the Lord, led a Christian life. His wife died, and after they had 4 children, one of whom, the little girl, was blind. And then he remarried Elizabeth and had 2 more children. But now he'd become a preacher in the Bedford Meeting House, which was recognised and acceptable. But then, when the monarchy was restored, this nonconformity was no longer acceptable, and he was charged with preaching, to which he pleaded guilty. He was then put in prison with no idea at the start how long, or if ever, he would be released. He was put into lockdown. Turns out he was in prison for 12 years. Apparently he coped with prison life by continuing to preach in prison, because there were warders and people there. And this was also where his writing started. He hadn't had a lot of education, but he went on to actually become quite a prolific writer. And he wrote a great number of books, the most famous for us being The Pilgrim's Progress. That's the one that we would all know him for. But he also wrote one about abundant grace. An ordinary man, but listening to God and working for him during the hardships. He knew that one day he would life inherit, and we sang that. And to me, John Bunyan showed us that when the state imposes things on us, even if perhaps in this case a lot of what they're imposing on us is definitely for our good, but John Bunyan showed that when the state imposes things on us, God is still there with us. An amazing good can come out of it. And I thought it interesting in what you prayed. Genesis 50, verses 19 to 21 says, Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. So my thought, and one of the fears, should we fear the government's impositions and government's changes? No, because good can and will come out of them, even if there is a point when our government's changes are not for our good, but just for their good. Part of what, and I didn't put the 2 together till now, part of what I felt about being honest with our children, etc. I'm not giving you false hope. What changes might come upon us may not always be for our good, but whatever it's intended for, good will come out of it if we continue in our circumstances as John Bunyan did. And he did come out of prison. He did go back another point just for a few months. His family followed the Lord, especially the young blind daughter, who apparently was the one that was allowed into prison to take him soup, etc. And he wrote Pilgrim's Progress, which many of us perhaps have read a shortened version of. We have a very big, old version of it where it's all falling apart, really. But then a lot of scholars have looked at his Amazing Grace, etc. So a lot of good came out of his lockdown. And then the second person that was coming into my mind was Corrie ten Boom. Corrie ten Boom was in her early 50s when she and her oldest sister were taken to the Nazi concentration camp in which her sister died. And subsequently, Corrie went on tour telling the world about Jesus. Ian has used several of Corrie's quotes in his daily encouragement, partially because I sent them to him, because Corrie has always been one of my favourite people. She trained to be a watchmaker herself, and in 1922 she became the first woman to be licensed as a watchmaker in the Netherlands. Over the next decade, in addition to working in her father's clock shop, she established a youth club for teenage girls and provided religious instruction and classes in the performing arts, sewing and handicrafts. She and her family were Calvinist Christians in the Dutch Reformed Church, and their faith inspired them to serve their society, which they did by offering shelter, food and money to those who were in need. This led them as a family to sheltering and helping to a place of safety Jews from many parts of the Netherlands during World War II in the hiding place. I've been to the house, and it's an amazing place to go into. It is open, but you also can just phone up and say that I'm in Amsterdam, I want to come to Haarlem, can it be open for me? And with 3 friends we went, and there was a couple of others who turned up also, and we went in. And the hiding place was it was a cupboard, and with a false back, and behind that and way down low, the people had to go in, somehow stand up, so that all of the wood can go back if they thought that the Gestapo were coming. And they had a few visits, but then of course there was the visit that led to Betsy and Casper, her dad, and Corrie being taken to be questioned. Subsequently, because of how old her dad was, I think probably a great matter of prayer, he actually was set free. But Corrie and Betsy ended up in a Nazi concentration camp. Initially, Corrie was restless and angry, in particular at the rough treatment of Betsy. Betsy was the oldest in the family and Corrie was the youngest. So there probably was a relationship there. Betsy probably mothered her at some point. But Betsy was always praying for her captors. And I suppose a lot of you know the story that subsequently one of those wardens became a Christian. But Betsy was also known to thank God for the fleas. Why would you thank God for fleas? Because it meant that their hut was not searched, and so that the Bible that they had hidden was kept safe. In one of her books, Corrie's books, Not Good If Detached, Corrie describes the secret of, in the end, the way they coped. And her name, the book, Not Good If Detached, is actually one of my favourites. And on the cover is a train ticket. And it had little perforated bit down there, and it said on the train ticket, "Not good if detached." If you halved them, that ticket was no good anymore. If you left it whole, if they were attached, the ticket was of value. And so Corrie said, as it says in the word, "If you abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing." So she learned how to be attached to Christ. So much so that that warden I was talking about came up to her one day in America and wanted to shake her hand and say, "Do you recognize me?" And Corrie's obviously going, "Yes." And the Lord saying, "Yes." And she shook his hand. What an amazing feeling that warden must have had. God, through Christ, had forgiven him. But to realise in the end, although it was very, very hard, obviously, for Corrie, she forgave him also, would be a fulfilment, wouldn't it, in him, which would help him or her carry on. So that verse, "Abide in me," is just telling us that through our lockdown, as long as we remain with him, we're no good if we're detached from the Lord. We have to remain attached in all our circumstances. And I think we've been able to do that, interestingly, through the Zoom meetings, through technology. We've been able to keep together, haven't we? Through it in writing. Just because people have taken time to pop things through letter boxes, to phone other people, we have kept attached. And it's not any one single person that's here. As I look around, everybody has helped keep us all attached. And so that's what we want to be, a part of this church together. And then a few more verses from Philippians, Richard, about someone that was a prisoner in chains for many years. Paul, the Apostle Paul, was a prisoner in chains for a long time, quite literally in chains. Not just maybe in chains some days and maybe not. Maybe we can be in the house, maybe we can go for a walk. Paul was in chains, shackled at the ankles to a Roman soldier. He was a tent maker by trade, and we know that he had at least one sister, because his sister's son told him, if you remember, whilst Paul was in prison, of a plan to ambush him as he was being transferred from one place to another. And interestingly, John Bunyan preached to the warders. Paul, as we know, preached to everybody that was allowed into the house where he was being kept in chains, and definitely to the Roman soldiers. Now, I don't know how many Roman soldiers he went through, because I don't know if some of them, if they were allowed even to think this, please don't let me be shackled to him. sometimes we can read what Paul said and think, woo, I don't like that. Imagine being shackled to Paul for 8 hours, because I think the Roman soldier probably felt more shackled than Paul did in his chains. And Paul, who was really just an ordinary person initially, that doesn't mean he didn't become an ordinary person, but some of the things he did because of Christ were extraordinary. But Paul had found a secret. He found a secret of being content in whatever circumstance he found himself. So we have these verses now. You can see why I was a bit confused when I kept getting all these verses. But the Lord knew exactly what he wanted us to be hearing. Well, he wants us to hear from Philippians. Paul said, I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that you, this is the Philippians, renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've heard the secret of being content. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. And that's the two little words, isn't it? Through him. And that's what we have to hold on to. And as we look at other passages in the Bible, we see that Moses trusted in the I am. We see that David trusted in the Lord. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted in their God, and in the fiery furnace, God was in it with them. Daniel, in the lion's den, just lay down and slept with the lions because God was with him. I really don't think what we're going through is quite as fiery as the fiery furnace, or quite like the lion's den. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying that it's not as difficult. Probably, it's definitely a lot less difficult. But it's through him who gives me strength. And Hosea was told also that the difficult place was going to be the door of hope. So this difficult place, and where we are today, is the door of hope, and perhaps it's the door beginning to open to others as we can share with them that even, if you like, church in this format can actually be very good. And there are many ordinary people who don't achieve that sort of thing, but who have the hope and who do hold on to what Christ has promised. They didn't see God face to face, and none of us as yet has seen God face to face, because that was another one that we found difficult, wasn't it? We wanted to be like this, face to face. But you know, we haven't seen yet God face to face, because that won't happen until we die and we meet with him. And yet, not seeing God face to face doesn't stop us having the strong relationship that we have with him. The relationship, the bond is still there. And we do need to know that one day we will see Jesus face to face. But in the meantime, we can feel his presence. It must be about 30 years ago now. I have always, unfortunately, gone through periods of being very tired. And often I would say to Ian, just need a cuddle. And he would say, he always wanted, sorry my dear, to spiritualize it and make a bit more a cuddle. I really wanted more than just a cuddle. I needed to do something perhaps a bit more. And we went to a YWAM run big tent meeting. And there was a lot of people over from Argentina, and not necessarily young people. And there was this, I see him now as an older gentleman. I mean, 30 years ago, I'd be in my early 40s, and this gentleman would be in his 80s. Well, it seemed old at that time. At that time, it seemed old. It doesn't seem so old now, I'm getting closer to it myself, but it seemed old. And we were going along the line, and somebody had prayed for Ian just ahead of me, and I got this gentleman, this old man, and he just put his arms around me and he hugged me and he said, there. Well, I went away dancing, very naughtily, as well as dancing because the Lord had touched me. There was a little bit of at Ian, and Ian having to accept that they're there was actually all I needed. So God is in the business of giving us hugs. He's in the business of touching us physically if we let him and if we realise that he can. I used to have a lot of time with Christiana. She's the first of our granddaughters. And we had been up in Scotland visiting Linda, because there's only 5 months between Christy and Rachel. Gone back home and she'd fallen. And I wasn't with her. And she'd cut her lip. And her mummy couldn't get her to stop crying. And so in the end, she phoned and says, Eleanor, she just will not stop crying. She needs you to do something. So I said to her, what's cut my lip? I said, right, well, I've got my fingers in my lip and I'm kissing it. I said, now I'm touching your lips, so you get your hand, you touch your lips, and I've kissed you better. And she stopped crying like that. We can make things hard for ourselves. And the Lord just wants to see. You can see me. You can feel me. One day you will see me face to face. One day I will be the one that will take you in those everlasting arms and hug you. But in the meantime, just now, just be aware that my arms are around you. And the thing that was common to all of these people is this hope in Jesus. And Richard, it was interesting because on Friday you were talking about hope and the daily encouragement. And this from Hebrews, to finish off with this. We have a hope. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain where our forerunner Jesus has entered on our behalf. We have a hope that is firm and secure. It's an anchor to our soul.